There are 4 ways to play in 40k. These ways to play come from the big rulebook about 40k, information Games Workshop has provided on their Warhammer community website, all compiled and then nicely arranged here, and some information from Games Workshop's web store. Some. Not much. Because it is unnavigable. You can't navigable it. You need a navigator, and basically, in its current state, you need to go back out of the website and then use a search engine to find the next page so that it can taunt you with its lies. But this is about the 4 ways to play 40k. But it is also about Legends units, which people think are a minor part of Warhammer 40,000, but actually play a much bigger part in the different ways to play. I see online again and again that a unit going to Legends is akin to death. Legend units not being played is part of the not so much confusion, but mismatch in Games Workshop's intention for this edition compared to what people generally play. Here's a community poll about Legends, and in the comments were a lot of different reasons why people did or didn't use Legends. So if you don't have the models, or you don't want to buy the models, that is totally fine. That's a reason not to use Legends. But there are reasons why the people who have the models still don't use them. If you're building up and practicing tournament play for a tournament, that's okay. But the Legends units, not on the app. So players are thinking that you're not meant to play with them. Them not being in the app is probably Games Workshop just saving time. They are tailoring their focus more to tournament players because online, tournament players are very loud. They don't make up the majority of players, but events and tournaments get their product's internet coverage. So the app is preset as suitable for tournament play. Other apps have a button that you can toggle off to remove Legends. I prefer that. It could be argued that a game without Legends is more balanced, as the points of some units in indexes and codexes will get updated, while the Legends units, their points are not going to be updated. So you get weird mismatches like the Dreadnought compared to the Venerable Dreadnought. So some people in my audience have just said they use codex rules for the models instead. Use a Spartan as a Land Raider, a Repressor as a Rhino. But balance is arbitrary when it comes to points. A massive horde of Objective Control 1 Blue Horrors is not going to be able to beat Imperial Knights, even if the points say it's balanced. And there are other issues with balance. One commenter mentioned a sorcerer on Disc of Tzeentch in a Chaos Space Marine army has the Dark Pacts rule, but it can also lead allied Rubric Marines which do not get the Dark Pacts rule when they're taken as allies to Chaos Space Marines. So there is some confusion about what stratagems and abilities that attached unit could use. But these issues are not limited to Legends units. I have a whole playlist where I look through a lot of the rules issues. There is some memory of 8th edition and some of 9th edition when the Forge World units had their own rules made by a separate rules team. This led to a wild variance in points per ability. That is no longer the case. The Legends rules are now done by the same people who make the index rules and the codex rules and points. Legends units now are rarely anything other than an overcosted or underpowered version of a very similar codex unit. But just because a unit is not intended for tournament play doesn't mean there are not 3 other ways to play with the Legend units. And if you're playing in the back of Greg's in Chipping Norton, why are you playing tournament style? So we need to talk about the 4 ways to play 40k. Soon. When I asked about Legends, you all gave me far more reasonable justifications than I was expecting, so that means I can't make fun of you. But who's this? Why, it's Strawman! The Straw Man! The person I have seen posting elsewhere on the internet in far less reasonable and angrier communities. Who say, no, oh, they have destroyed my model, my ironclad dreadnought's gone. No. Unless James of Games Workshop came round your house and used a blowtorch to burn your model, you still have that model. Games Workshop isn't going to sell it anymore, but you wouldn't be complaining about them destroying a model if you didn't already have that model. Oh, they're gone! Games Workshop took them from me, I can't use them in games of 40k anymore. You can. There are rules for them, they just moved house. I'm assuming that you just didn't know that, or didn't know where they are, rather than you lack object permanence. The rules for the Ironclad Dreadnought is not in the Space Marines Codex, they are in the Legends PDF. I have linked the location for a lot of things I'm going to be talking about, including the Legends PDF, in the description, because people had mentioned that the rules are now harder to find. Their points are also in a separate document, and some of the 30k vehicles that are viable for Space Marine Legends are in another PDF, if you want to use them in 40k games. So Legends units are not being removed, and Legends are not as big a thing as you may have been led to believe in the previous editions of 40k. But we need to now talk about the ways to play in 10th edition of 40k, which I'm actually going to do now. Open play. Open play was an 8th edition idea, a sort of do what you want. The main rulebook gave 3 suggestions for battles, and that was about all that was ever mentioned for it. In open play, all rules are optional. The vague understanding people have is that this is for new players, and it sort of is. If you are just starting out, don't go full tournament play. It'll be too much and you risk disliking the game from the tsunami of rules that you have to learn very quickly. So you can ease yourself into 40k rules at a time. If you don't want to do detachments, don't do them. If you want to miss out on command points and stratagems, you can. I would still use objectives because there are a lot of units rules that interact with objectives like the Sisters of Battle and Cadian Shock Troops, but you can ignore secondary objectives. You could have different points levels, 500 points versus 800 points to give an advantage to a newer, perhaps much younger, player, and get them interested in how cool their soldiers are. But aside from new players, you can also do it with your opponent to have a lot of different variations. You could do points per model, rather than having the much more restrictive set of 3 Arcoflagellants, no point specified for a set of 6 Arcoflagellants, so a 6 Arcoflagellant unit would have to use the same points as 10 Arcoflagellants, at which point you feel you're missing 4 Arcoflagellants. So you could play points per model instead. You could use custom units. We've talked about them before. We made some. And you could have some homebrew detachment rules for factions that only have 1 detachment. Again, I've done a video on that. There are scenarios that come out in the White Dwarf magazines. These could be considered to be open play because they have no secondary missions and don't form part of an overarching narrative like we're going to mention later on, for a different way to play. If you want to make up your own scenarios based on a 4th edition mission from the core rulebook of that edition, I love it. But this is considered the weird way to play, the no rules Wild West, or Madness Land, where no rule is fixed and everything is optional. Have cover work however you want. And now that I've talked about what open play offers, I need to tell you that open play doesn't exist anymore. There is no open play in 10th edition. You see how little it was supported before, with 3 suggestion missions in 8th edition, and that was it. Part of the reason is it's setting up that you are making a rule that there are no rules. It's hard to make more rules after that. So no, even the chapter title on this video is wrong, but I need that so that pre-existing players understand the familiar format. But I like to include all this to make a point that all of the ways of playing the game that I just mentioned, making up your own cover rules, using points per model, they are totally valid ways to play a game with friends, the people you're most likely to be playing with. Fun is the purpose of the game. I like fun. I don't dress like this to be incredibly serious. And I want you to have fun, and I want you to think about the ways you can add more fun to your 40k games. And we haven't even got back to Legends units yet, but yes, Legend units can be used in that open play format. But really, the first way to play is Combat Patrol. Combat Patrol is a simplified version of 40k. It uses a lot of the same rules, but with some modifications. The idea is you buy a box, it is an army in a box, and all of that is balanced, allegedly, against every other Combat Patrol box. All of these boxes are the same price, you get a variable number of models in them, and some of them are monopose, some of them the actual kits. The Genestealer Cult one is really good, and I suggest that, with another video of course. All of these videos I'm mentioning are also linked in the description. But Combat Patrol is there, very much being targeted towards new players, and that includes players that want to try or start a new army. Combat Patrol as a style or an idea existed in past editions as 500-point games or less. Simpler missions on a smaller table size, 44 inches by 30 inches, as a good way to learn how to play and enjoy your games with a smaller collection. So 10th edition Combat Patrol is on that size board and has a few simple missions that will help you learn 40k. But maybe you started an army and you didn't have time to continue. It's good that you don't need 2,000 points of painted models just to play the game. That would be a lot of time and effort and money to start. I still recommend playing with whatever you have at 500 points using the Combat Patrol missions that are free online from Games Workshop Community's download page. Again, that's linked in the description. That is fun. But the reason the 500 points isn't what you get in a box now is because that would be 7 Custodes models or 70 Imperial Guardsmen. And they want to sell these Combat Patrol boxes at the same price, The plastic doesn't get cheaper just because it's a human with a lasgun compared to a human woman in power armor with a bolt gun at the same sort of size and similar amounts of plastic. So they have manufactured balance, different data sheets to the main 40k, different stratagems that keep the Custodes toned down and let the Imperial Guard units recycle to keep up with attrition. All of the weapon options are fixed, so you can't have some demolition charges, some mining weapons, some auto pistols, some hand flamers. It's fixed to what it suggests in the combat patrol. For the rest of 40k, I wouldn't suggest building them exactly as it suggests in the combat patrol, just so you have some main 40k play with the models how you want. And then for combat patrol, just say, yeah, these 5 acolytes, they're the 5 acolytes as they should be with these fixed weapons. And that in a nutshell is the combat patrol style of game. The box, plus the mission, and that's it, with a little bit of the core rules. A good way to learn. The next way to play is narrative play. Now that's how we know it from 8th edition. So running a campaign with the 8th edition Urban Conquest expansion, refighting major battles of the past with missions in the rulebook, that was all narrative things from 8th edition. I liked 8th edition, partly because it took a lot of good stuff from 4th edition and built upon it. In 10th edition, narrative play is mainly Crusade. There are occasional refights on Warhammer Community that fall into this category, like the Battle for the Lion's Gate. Again, you can see why I use the 8th edition terminology instead of just calling it Crusade, because there's a bit more to it, but as far as the 10th edition core rules are concerned, Crusade. In Crusade, you take a force, you can slowly build upon it to get a roster of units. When you make an army to fight a battle, you can only use the units that are in your roster. As your units kill enemy units, they get bonus experience, and you can spend your experience points on unit upgrades and special weapons. But if your units die in battle, you roll a dice to see if they're really actually affected by that, or if it was just a flesh wound. And if you roll a 1, then they get a scar, a permanent bad thing. And there's a whole system for removing scars and changing them and things like that. There is no FAQ for any rules issues, there's no support for rules, there's no balance patches for items or upgrades. And I love it. It reminds me of the earlier editions of 40k. Do what's fun, figure it out between the 2 players who are very much on the same page about doing this thing for fun. So if the Canoness goes down but is resurrected by a stratagem, do they have to take an out of action test at the end? Yes, probably, which would represent the hero fighting on, but then once the battle is done, they collapse as the exhaustion hits them. Very dramatic. There are specific missions for Crusade, and I'm going to talk about them in way more detail in a future video, so this is the reminder to click the subscribe button so you don't miss that. But it's all about telling a story, developing your army with its own success stories and that one unit that just keeps failing that we don't talk about much. And as you go on, your army levels up with the number of units that have positive traits compared to negative scars. So each unit, as well as the army as a whole, has a leveling system. Crusade encourages you to tell a story across a lot of battles, not just with the Crusade rules, but having a unit act according to their character. So if a Tau unit was surrounded, does the Ethereal order the remaining force to fall back as the surrounded unit dies for the greater good, or does a Fireblade instead order some Kroot to countercharge and save the unit for the greater good? Ooh, how does your narrative fit in the wider 40k universe? If a battle is over and you know who will win by turn 3, do you keep fighting to get rid of that horrible Hellbrute that ravaged your forces? Do you make the enemy pay in blood? In Crusade games, there are benefits to doing that. Well, that's a very different way of playing to normal 40k. Normal 40k, as we understand it, is competitive play. This is also called match play. The name suggests competition or playing in a football match against someone, but this is not as part of an event. Tournament play does that. Even the phrases we use are not very helpful for separating in our minds what is normal 40k compared to 40k as a group contest. In standard 10th edition 40k games, you use the rules in the rulebook. It's that simple. You use the secondary missions from something like the Leviathan mission deck. Other mission decks should be available in the future. This is the standard way to play. Terrain is set up like in the rulebook. Vaguely, just depending on what you have in your terrain collection. Objectives work as they're described here in the main rules. You can't step on the middle because there's meant to be a thing there, but you can walk through it, same as you can walk through a friendly model. Use the secondary mission cards as they're written. No FAQ or addendum to them. All the units are available, including legends, their points are listed in a separate document. So this is how the majority of 40k games are played. They're not Combat Patrol, they're not Crusade games, it's this. In 8th and 9th edition, tournament play also fell under this, and competitive stuff was just the whole thing. So people have gotten used to using tournament-style rules in their regular games of 40k, and it looks like for this edition, Games Workshop is not intending that at all. You use the rules in the main rulebook, you don't use the tournament FAQs and addendums and things for your everyday games. Tournament style is the 4th way to play, and it's separated from the competitive side in this edition as some of the rules are different. This isn't just tournament organisers adding their own rules, which they're free to do. Games Workshop, for their Games Workshop run 40k tournaments, have had their own FAQ. I did a video about that, and they've added extra suggestions and changes to the core rulebook for when you're playing 40k as a competitive sport. So terrain gets set up in a particular way. I find it boring, but this blocks line of sight across the table so that no one gets just wiped away by first turn shooting. There are no trees, there are no craters. Every single battle is a city fight among ruins. The objectives in tournament play aren't solid. You can stand on them and, in theory, hide them with a really big base. And some of the secondary missions in the Leviathan mission deck have been changed, altering the number of victory points you get. So you get some extra restrictions, you get some setup changes, but this is in order to make the game more balanced as a sport. And this is the way to play where you can't use legends. If you're playing a very small open play kind of 500 point game, you can use legends. Crusade game, use legend. Everyday competitive 40k play, you can use legend units. Tournaments don't use legends because of the kind of issue on balance, and because their points are not going to be updated. But you can still use legends at some tournaments because some of the tournaments allow a narrative focus campaign, as they did a Warhammer 40,000 Grand narrative at Atlanta. But in the tournament way to play, having a fair and equal game is prioritized over having a fun game. I'm not saying tournaments aren't fun, you can absolutely enjoy tournaments, but winning takes precedence over fun, whereas in all the other versions of 40k, I find that fun comes first, winning comes second. That's the idea, and then you try and be sportsmanlike about it. To make it even more balanced, in theory, in future, Games Workshop could bring back points per weapon for everyday games, but much like Combat Patrol, have fixed or limited weapon options to have even more balance for tournament play. So no Thunderhammers or Lightning Claws, only heirloom weapons for tournament play. That's a possibility for 11th edition. And this gives more balance for factions that don't have much in the way of weapon choices, like the Necron army. In another edition, I suppose Combat Patrol could be considered under the competitive setting. You use the rules as written, no extra tournament advice or FAQ about terrain, but because of how fixed the units are, with the only options being a secondary objective and an enhancement, then they could fall into tournament play. But where does Boarding Patrol fit? I suppose that would depend on the format used with the rules. If you wanted to just play around in a spaceship, it's more open play style. If it was part of a storyline, narrative play. And competitive and tournament play versions are also possible. The lines have just become very blurry in 10th edition, whereas they were fixed in our mind for 8th edition. But we need to remember that tournament play and everyday competitive play are not the same. Let's just have the standard be competitive play, you have your core rules, you follow the rules. We'll just move the arrow slightly from here to here. And if you really want, you can still use the tournament terrain setup if you find that you're getting blown off the board in turn 1. We have that mindset of last edition and 8th edition still lingering, in that there were 3 ways to play, and legends were only for open and narrative play. A competitive game based on skill and your available models wouldn't have legends, and you were expected to ask your opponent's permission in those editions before you were using them. That is no longer the case. You can use legends units in your everyday competitive games, you don't need a permission slip from a teacher, you just use the nice models that you have painted. And I like the memorable games which came up in the earlier editions, which were a bit more janky and had more of a narrative spin. In particular, I'm thinking of 2nd edition, which I talked about a lot in the video. But they had more that sticks in my brain than the tournament games with the same terrain setup every time and the same points and similar scenarios. Don't limit yourself to what people around you think is the correct or normal way to play 40k. Every community has their weird character that is different to the others and stands out as odd. There's probably a 40k YouTuber that's considered weird compared to all the others. It's me, isn't it? Well, the way you play will probably end up being a mix of several ways to play anyway, but use your Legends units. As long as there are rules for them in the Legends documents. I'm not letting it go. Look at how they massacred my girls. Filthy Games Workshop took them from me. I can't use them in my games of 40k anymore.